and welcome Twin Cities Orthopedics and Training House community partners. We are so excited to gather with you this morning or afternoon or evening, whenever works for you, to really dive into this material. Lizzie and I are super excited to talk about supportive fueling today, how we recognize our fueling athletes, and then create a really nourished nutrition culture where we can have an empowered environment surrounding our fueling. So we're going to bring up some slides and visuals as we dive in today. We do have a lot on our plate in this next half an hour. First, we're going to focus on energy availability, what that means, and how we build on some of the steps that we've already learned over our Educate to Elevate sessions. We're going to then learn a little bit about the female athlete triad and relative energy deficiency in sport and how we can recognize that as a support system for an athlete. And we're going to wrap up with lots of practical nutrition tips and interventions and ways to really build a strong culture on your team. All right, so focusing first on energy availability. If you've been with us through the last couple Educate to Elevate sessions surrounding nutrition, we've really focused on what energy is and how we achieve it and breaking down barriers to achieving that energy in our big nutrients, carbs, protein, and fats. So now as we look at our energy at its foundational level, really managing energy levels is the biggest and most important daily priority for our student athletes and athletes at any level. And to be honest, like our student athlete time to manage those energy levels is often very sparse. As we talked about before, there's a lot of things that our athletes are managing in a day-to-day time frame, including their competition and training, which is what we all are focusing a lot of efforts on, but as well as our health and our fueling in general, our relationships. Sleep takes so much time. All of these things have to be energized in order for us to make up that big 20% of the time that our athletes truly are on the court, on the field, in the weight room, and competing and doing what they love. So in order to make up that time, we focus on the energy availability that they have to do all of the things that makes them a student athlete in and of themselves. Now, as we know, our energy or our ability to work, to survive, to thrive, comes from our food or comes from calories. And we find those in our big nutrients, our carbs, protein, and fat. I do encourage you to jump back into our other Educate to Elevate sessions to review these today too. Now, as we are working throughout our athletic career and we transition all throughout the year's time frame at different points of the season, sometimes our energy needs change and our training thresholds change. And so a lot of our needs are dependent on the time of the year, the demand of our sport, the type of sport that we are in, and even the environment outside. Now, on our base level, our body is constantly playing this balancing act when it comes to our energy as well. The calories or the food that we consume are extremely important to balance, again, that whole plate or the whole picture surrounding our athletic endeavors and to support them. So when we are looking at our energy balance, we are constantly giving up and taking what our body needs in order to have that homeostasis or that balance for survival to then get to the ability to thrive. So all the energy or calories that we take in go to support our body from a very base level, from our cellular maintenance. And that is just like, as we sit here listening to this presentation today, our body's going through hundreds of thousands of metabolic processes and using so much energy to do so. Just the ability to maintain our temperature, our immunity, fighting all these viruses and illnesses everywhere, that takes a lot of work for your gut to do too. Just our daily growth and repair as a growing athlete and a balanced athlete as well. And then maintaining balance for the workout and dedication to recover from our workouts and healing that takes place every single day as we train. And then for our female athletes as well, maintaining our menstrual cycle, and male athletes too, in maintaining that hormonal balance. So all of these things are going on at every point of the day. As we intentionally or unintentionally do not consume quite enough energy, that balance starts to be tipped. And at that point, go ahead, Lacey. And at that point, we start to give up some of our basic human functions that in turn affect our performance as well. We start getting sicker more often. Our growth or repair from our workouts is hindered. The recovery from our workouts is far slated in the way that it makes us feel sore and less powerful and not get quite as much as we wanted to out of the work that we put in for our sport. We don't heal as quick as expected after or before an injury. And then our hormonal balance is shifted as well. Now, as dedicated athletes, even when a lot of these things are impaired, athletes still show up, right? They still want to uphold their expectations for their coach, for their team. It's a part of your identity. You still want to push through and perform at your greatest level. Now, when we push through those things, often at some point, our daily activities, our workouts are slighted as well. And at that point is when our performance is really hindered. And we have to move through that balance and start to put our body back together and get back to that base level when our energy is meeting our needs for our performance and our health as well. Now, one thing to be really aware of when we are dealing with this low energy availability or when our body is not quite getting enough energy, is in our athletes and the athletes that we support, we may see or experience a rapid and unsustainable weight loss. When we are training hard but not improving our performance, we have this inability to build or gain strength with the dedication that we are showing for. When we are experiencing a variety of injuries, stress fractured, repeated bone injuries, injuries that come from overuse or that are not healing as expected. All of those are signs that our body just does not have enough energy to put itself back together. Again, when we are getting sicker more frequently or have this chronic fatigue, it's like I feel like I'm hitting a wall every morning, even though I'm getting sleep. We also see then in females, as we'll talk about a little later too, an absent or irregular menstrual cycle or period. Now, a big thing that often happens, and one of the first things that can happen is this increased level of irritability and signs of depression. Now, imagine yourself, have you ever been hangry, right? Like, I just really need a snack. I know I'm getting annoyed. Like, I just really have to eat something, right? Imagine your body is hangry in this chronic form. That's what happens when we have low energy availability and our energy balance does not equate to what our body needs. Other hormonal changes as well. And a big one that we often have athletes kind of show up with is gastrointestinal problems or digestive distress. Now, one thing that we often see is a lot of constipation, a lot of bloating, and our nutrition muscles inside are just trying to go kind of back to sleep because they don't have enough energy in and of themselves as well. And one of the first things that athletes and or support systems often do is cut out more food groups, like TikTok, Instagram, they'll tell us you have to cut out dairy or cut out gluten if you're feeling bloated or if we have that GI distress. But a lot of the times that actually exacerbates the problems too and makes that energy intake even more difficult to achieve. And when we have an imbalance of our energy intake as well, when those nutrition muscles are not firing like we need them to, that's just going to slow down that muscle mechanism. And you're going to have an increase of constipation and bloating and these things when your digestive tract is just not getting enough energy before we even get to any other kind of specific foods that might be causing some sensitivities. And another thing to be aware of as well when we are seeing signs and symptoms of low energy availability is disordered eating practices, such as skipping meals, avoiding certain foods, fad or crash dieting, which we're going to dive in deeper today. Now, low energy availability, or we have this imbalance, comes from a variety of intentions. And most often, it's actually unintentional efforts that lead us to have inadequate energy intake. Sometimes athletes are just not aware of how much energy they need to get in day to day. And then they have a really packed schedule and not a lot of time to do so, even when they do. So It was even just this week, I had an athlete come in and he had thought, okay, I needed about like 2,500 calories or so. And when we really put pen to paper and took a dive into his nutrition from his skeletal muscle mass angle and his individual needs, he actually needed about 4,800 calories. So his intention was completely positive. He wanted to get the food and the nourishment in that his body needed, but his awareness of what his body needed just wasn't at the level that it needed to be. There are other pieces of unintentional efforts when athletes have an inadequate access to food and or the logistics of their day just do not allow them to eat what they need and when they need. We really work through those fueling barriers to make sure that that is not a pattern that escalates. Intentional weight loss efforts can also lead to low energy availability. And when really supported by a sports medicine provider, a sports dietitian, and a science-based sports medicine team, we can do that in a very safe way to achieve the body composition needed for sport. But it comes with a lot of detail orientation. Some athletes deal with pressure to work towards a specific weight or competitive pressure that leaves them in an energy deficit, or after injury, having pressure to maybe not have changes in their body composition, even though their training load has changed. So we really take a dive into these intentional weight loss efforts to make sure that they are safely done and in a way that the athlete knows what their body still needs. And then there are other efforts that can blend into an intentional way to restrict our energy. And we want to be really aware of those too. Disordered eating, purposeful restriction, again, pressure that is intentional or not, other mental health concerns or negative body image start to tailor into some of our disordered eating practices we want to be aware of. And then at a deeper level as well, this can sometimes develop into clinical eating disorders, which we'll talk about more today as well. Anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, binge eating disorders are some of the most common. And this is what really demands a sports medicine team referral if you don't already have a sports medicine team that you work with day to day. So we're going to work towards some ways to recognize those and make sure that you feel confident in trying to be proactive with these as well. Now, what's really, I think, important to know and realize is that when we're thinking about eating disorders and disordered eating, it's really a spectrum of patterns that we see. And most people will experience some sort of episode of disordered eating sometime in their life, whether intentional or not. But there's a lot of things, and actually research will show 40 plus different factors that go into every single eating decision. And when we start to grow up in a culture that is oriented around weight and shape and good and bad, then that starts to escalate and change someone's food identity. So some of our functional fueling behaviors where we have body acceptance and are confident about our athletic endeavors, non-restrictive healthy eating habits within that and doing and focusing on nourishment for our energy levels and achieving our safe and healthful body weights and for our body types as well. That could be a really positive thing. And many times then over periods of life can morph into weight and shape preoccupation that's taking away from our day-to-day activities, excessive exercising outside of the need for our sport, this strive for perfection that gets in the way of our daily activities as well, and or compulsive overeating or overeating out of stress as well too. And other things that often are oriented with some disordered eating practices are listed here. Now, our goal always and foremost is to be proactive in catching on this spectrum, kind of where an athlete or an individual is experiencing distress with fueling and their fueling patterns. Because our goal is always to avoid and or limit our rates of clinical eating disorders, as rates are pretty high in sport in comparison to the average population. Now, when we look at our models of energy availability, previous to even getting into our disordered eating mindset as well, when we have athletes that are in this level of low energy availability, we want to be aware of some of the tools that we can use to really connect with our athletes in that state too. And one thing that we do as sports dietitians and with our sports medicine team is relate to the syndrome called REDS. If you haven't heard about it, I'm super excited to talk to you about it today. But REDS is coined as relative energy deficiency in sport. And if you have been involved in sports medicine teams before, we've heard a lot about the female athlete triad. And this was a connection of a few different symptoms related to low energy availability or energy deficiency in sport, with a decrease in our bone health or a reoccurring rate of stress fractures, stress reactions, and other bony injuries, as well as hormonal malfunction as well, and our menstruation absence and our inability to gain our menstrual cycle as female athletes due to our high training load. Now, recent research, and as we have expanded that research throughout the years, has allowed sports medicine teams to really see and understand that low energy availability and that just not achieving the energy that your body needs can happen to not just females, but males as well, and affects so many different systems within our body too. So our relative energy deficiency in sport, or when we are experiencing an energy deficit related to that imbalance between the energy that we take in and the energy that we put out, when that is less than what we need for our basic function and our athletic function, we have this kind of plethora of symptoms that occur. And we know that when we have low energy, this affects our gastrointestinal health. And we have, again, more constipation, more GI distress, and more kind of stomach aches than we normally would. It affects our cardiovascular health too, our psychological health, and that higher rate of depression, irritability, anxiety, even from like a growth and development state. When we have athletes who are in high school and even previous to that, who are training at a high load and just not getting the energy in that they need, this can hinder their long-term growth and development. Even just speaking to a case that we're dealing with now in an outpatient setting, I have an athlete who is training at a very high load in season and competing and training 20 plus hours a week, right? And she came in a couple of years ago and experiencing all of a sudden not getting her period and didn't really know what was going on. And then we found out, okay, well, she's getting sick far more often than she realized and what was normal for her and her family. And what was really annoying to her and why she came in is because she had a lot of constipation and a lot of bloating. And that is not fun to feel on the field or on the court, wherever you are. Seeing a sports medicine provider, I had realized that she had a really low resting heart rate. And when she was working out, her heart rate was skyrocketing in a way that they did not expect. Later on, they had also gained some treatment with a sports psychologist and realized, okay, this is actual tangible like depression that my athlete is going through, and had connected some of those internal feelings that she was feeling as well. Over the previous year, related to her hematology or her like blood health, we had discovered that she was dealing with iron deficiency, and so her body wasn't able to use the energy that she was taking in, and that led to a lot of hormonal changes, and she had almost no estrogen in comparison to what her body needed. And then within a week's time frame, she was diagnosed with a stress fracture. So this is kind of one case example that where REDS, or a relative energy deficiency in sport, really led to a plethora of things going on that were recognized. Then as we dove into our nutrition analysis, she was actually only getting about 44% of the energy that her body needed. But we just didn't have that awareness before, and all these things seem so disconnected. Now, from an athlete standpoint, often with high level athletes or even developing athletes, sometimes our iron levels are not so motivating, or, tell me I'm going to get sick more often. I don't really care. I just want to do my sport. So some of the things in this REDS model that we use to really support our athletes is connecting it to the research as to how low energy availability also affects their athletic performance too. When we have a decreased endurance ability or muscle strength, our glycogen stores, or our ability for our energy to last, is hindered, that is something that impairs their overall goal and your overall identity in sport as well. Depression, irritability, decreased concentration and coordination, all mental health and brain health things that affect our ability to perform. And so this is what we often will use as a tangible difference with the athletes to make sure that they have a connection to why their body needs energy and how we strive to hit our nutrition so that we can hit our health, so that we can hit our performance from a foundational level. Now, we have looked through the research and we know that there are sports that are at higher risk of low energy availability and higher risk of developing disordered eating too. So as we dive in, we know that some sports that demand kind of lesser, I would say lesser clothing on the body, that are a little more invasive in that, endurance sports and those sports that demand kind of weight classes or differences in those. We see higher rates in our kind of endurance sports in that track and field related, but also team sports. And in a recent research, over 30% of NCAA Division I athletes were dealing with low energy availability. And another point, really athletic sports or kind of dance-oriented sports, where some of the research shows that it's 80+% of those athletes are dealing with low energy availability. So we have some sports that we see higher rates in, but again, a lot of the research is pointing us to that, and we know that this can happen with any sport, any team, any sort of athletic modality. And we want to make sure that we are aware of being proactive in that. Now, some of the characteristics then that the research shows us may have higher risk too is when, of course, an athlete has an eating disorder, that will lead to a predisposition to low energy availability too. But other things that we could be aware of when there are extreme changes in training intensities without accompanying nutrition changes, that leaves our athletes really predisposed to these signs and symptoms. So this actually happened quite a bit over COVID when all of a sudden everything was shut down and our athletes could not train in the way that they were used to. And then when things started to open back up, it was like 0 to 100 and athletes going from nothing to training all the time and trying to get that out. And we saw these symptoms of low energy availability and REDS really skyrocket in our practice. When again, we have inadequate food availability and access to food or financial insecurity, that's something that we have to check in on for all of our athletes at any stage, because it's sometimes difficult to ask for support in that. Other cultural practices that may really promote low energy intake, again, cycling body mass or changing weight classes, especially at a developmental level, could be a sign or a predisposition for low energy availability. And throughout the research, there is a predisposition shown for the female gender too. And it's important to recognize that, but also know that there's building research even recently surrounding this syndrome with males to be aware of too. So we don't want to make the assumption that it's only females who will deal with REDS as well. Weight sensitive sports, and one more to be aware of is having a teammate who has an eating disorder. Athletes are at a much higher risk of developing low energy availability practices or a disordered eating themselves when they have a teammate or someone close in their family or friend group or influence that is struggling with disordered eating as well. Now, we're going to look at some action steps though, right? First, we develop that awareness, and now we want to know what to do next.
Thank you so much, Kayla. All right, yeah, so we're going to dive into these action steps and ways that we can, how can coaches and parents and teammates and athletes, how can we take what we've just discussed and apply that to our daily lives? So diving in here, there are kind of 4 different pillars that we're going to start with diving in. So first is creating culture. It could be that your teams or your staff, like you probably already have a culture that you're working off of. It could be that cultures change over time, like as athletes graduate or move on. No matter what, it's always going to be there. And so it's really important to think about what is that culture like for your teams. And then we'll talk about ways to kind of steer that in different ways too, or mold that into healthy healthy practices and just an inviting culture. We're also going to talk about tools, ways to listen, what to look for as coaches, as parents, what tools do we have, and what can we tune into to make sure that we're mitigating any risks there. Are there signs of reds happening in different athletes that we interact with? What can we listen and look for there? And then of course, education is super important here. How can we educate ourselves? Again, as coaches, as parents, no matter what phase of life you're in, and as teammates and as athletes, how can we educate ourselves to set everyone up for success? All right, so your support role with culture again. This will start with your actions. Even if you're a young athlete or if you're a coach who's been coaching for years, if you're a parent, it starts with you to create this culture. So leading with your actions, even if we feel like our athletes might not do what we tell them to do all the time, they are absolutely still listening to you. They are watching you as parents. They are looking up to you. They respect you. So how can we set those examples with our actions? So it could start with, how do we fuel ourselves, again, as dietitians or as sports personnel, sports med team, and as coaches specifically? What are we fueling with? Are we having a few meals during the day? Are we snacking? Are we having quality items? I remember I was a distance athlete in high school, and one of my coaches, she was phenomenal. She was a very accomplished athlete, but she valued fueling. And I remember a few times a week, she would bring like an ice cold Mountain Dew with her to practice. And she would tell us to hydrate, of course, and to fuel after we were done with our run and have dinner later on and not just study the whole night. But she would enjoy her Mountain Dew a few times a week. And I always I loved that. And I thought that was a really great example of just like well-roundedness. And just like healthy language around that too. So how can we set an example and demonstrate that balance? And then encouraging our staffing or our peers to do the same. And then if you're like an adult or a parent who feels like you need some of that support with your nutrition and you've never really sought it out before, it's never too late to seek out that help. Because if you want to set that example for your child or for your athletes, it's okay to start with yourself and figure out what support you need to be able to demonstrate that good example. And then using your words. This is going to be really important, the words that we use when discussing our bodies, nutrition. We want to be able to frame it towards function and performance and energy versus appearance. So we want to maybe swap out some words that we might already be using. So really think critically about that as a team. We want to avoid discussing diets and body concerns, maybe our own. We don't really want to project. We want to be careful about how we, project those things, because I know that we all have some things, maybe insecurities or things that we want to work on, but let's think about how we can be proactive in helping ourselves first, and then trying to be careful about how we discuss that with our team and with our young athletes. And then avoid discussing fad diets, supplements, labels, and also trying to avoid all or nothing talk. So this is good and this is bad, or this is healthy and this is unhealthy. How can we find that neutral language? How can we focus on fuel as like all food can be fuel? How can we be functional there? And how is this food functional for your performance? Trying to word it that way instead. And then again, this is a safe sport rule, but never recommending diets or weight loss plans for our athletes or for your teammates. Want to be very careful there. We don't want to be doing that, because remember, we are role models in many different ways. So how can we lead by that example? Be intentional about the culture you're creating for your athletes around health and performance. So in order to, again, pull this all together and even implement this, start having those conversations. Let's bring all of these topics in that may be hard to talk about or maybe have been hard to talk about in the past, and let's just start having that dialogue. It could start with a coach, or again, with your department or with your staff, and then with your teams, bringing that to your teams and bringing in those topics and having those discussions in a safe environment. So get really clear on what asking for help looks like. How are we talking about our body image, our mental health, those risks of eating disorders and disordered eating that Kayla covered. What are those signs? And we're going to go into what to look for and what to listen for too, but how can we even just start the conversation around these things that are prevalent? So define that plan. Just openly address myths that happen. There's so much social media out there that our athletes are exposed to. I'm sure parents see that all the time as well. So how can we just address these myths head on? Can you talk to a nutrition professional and bring someone in to really set the record straight on a lot of these things that can be detrimental narratives in our athletes' lives? And so this means, like I said, including sports med teams, teachers, coaching staff, make sure everyone is really well informed around what is going to be the collective narrative that we share with our teams. Is it that we really want to talk openly about having a regular period and how that is a really good sign of fueling and health? That is never going to go away. So we want to be able to talk about that and learn about it. How can we talk about how are we talking about body fat metrics or even body composition? Is that even relevant with your athletes right now? Or do we just want to help them focus on fueling, but maybe even just gaining a little bit of knowledge around what are the parameters there? Like, how is that even measured? So just maybe getting a general sense of knowledge, but not trying to be really careful about how we talk about that with athletes. And then again, adequate nutrition practices. Going back to my coaches in high school, they would always say, like, do you have your nutrition? Do you have your post fuel? They would just say, do you have your fuel? Make sure you bring your fuel. So can we install some of those mottos that we use every day? And again, making that safe space, that's going to be so important with that team culture. Can we just create those conversation spaces, make it a regular part of the team? Because then everyone will feel safer in that space, like they can confide in our coaches and in our parents. We want to just be able to bring those discussion topics to the forefront. And then again, wrapping it all up, but being mindful about those messages and everything that we just talked about. Okay, so going into what to listen for and what to look for will kind of mirror each other. But as we know, teammates and athletes, like, they become very close on their team and they share a lot of narratives with each other, or they confide in one another. And so as parents and as coaches, what can we listen for along the way, again, to be able to detect any risks of REDs or of low energy availability, a lot of these issues that are really prevalent that we discussed. So are we hearing about constant struggles with sleep? We know that these athletes have a lot on their plates, but it doesn't mean that they can't prioritize sleep to a point. Again, it's that balance, is trying to find that and define that. So are we hearing about poor sleep? Are we hearing about irregular missing periods? Do our female athletes, do they feel like that's a normal thing? Again, how can we switch that narrative? Are we hearing about overwhelming signs of stress, anxiety, GI upset, like we mentioned? Foods or food groups that athletes are avoiding for whatever reason. Maybe we're hearing about someone who's shivering, cold. It's a sign of underfueling, feeling out of control or overwhelmed just in life and with everything going on. And then listening for excuses, maybe not to eat. So if you're saying bring your post-practice fuel, oh, I don't have it because I'm gonna eat when I get home, or just things like that. Just note it and try to listen for some of those things that come up. Other patterns to look for, again, more physical signs and symptoms here, but does an athlete who normally has a lot of energy, are they becoming really tired and sluggish recently? Are they getting dizzy? Has an athlete been fainting maybe? Brain fog, lack of focus? Is an athlete becoming really ill, or frequent injuries happening, maybe even stress or bone injuries that they weren't experiencing before? So look for some of those patterns that may be, just out of the ordinary. Sudden changes in mood, frequent trips to the bathroom with that GI upset, and then avoiding food and fueling, and dramatic changes in body size or shape, like dramatic weight loss, or just other signs that shows that there's an imbalance with their fueling. So we're bringing this all together. We're bringing these plates back just to note, but educating our athletes about just the basics of good fueling. So encouraging those few meals a day and purposeful snacks, and also defining that nutrition strategy around what constitutes or what makes up a meal versus what makes up a snack. So like coffee alone is not a meal. Or, carrots. I had carrots at lunch. What else did you have? Did you, were you able to fuel with other good foods there? So just helping these athletes really know and define what a meal snack can look like for them and how that influences their performance. And then honoring the hunger and fullness cues, that's really huge, because hunger and fullness cues, those are coming from hormones that our body's creating to let us know when we need more fuel or when we're good. And so really learning how to recognize those and encouraging athletes to recognize those as well. And also knowing that after a workout, it is very normal for our digestive system or our appetites to be suppressed or decreased, because we just put ourselves through a lot of stress and we're recovering from that. And so it's normal to not just feel super hungry right afterwards, but even so, we know that post-workout fuel is very important for muscle recovery, for performing the next day. So really encouraging that, and just finding those times during the day when maybe our appetite is suppressed, but it's still very necessary to fuel, and training our gut to expect that fuel. So just kind of keeping those things in mind. And then developing realistic, performance oriented, well-rounded, healthy-minded weight and body composition goals with the help of a health professional, of course. And just again, finding that balance where we're focusing on our function, we're focusing on our performance and how we're feeling. And then making fueling realistic and breaking down barriers to achieve proper fuel. So it could look different for every team, every organization, but is it making fueling just more available using some sort of tools you guys have, or is it talking with parents at the beginning of the year at that parent meeting, just saying like, this is going to be a really big focus of our team is nutrition and wellness. And so how can we make sure that there's a pattern involved with helping our athletes get what they need, at different times of the day and pre and post. And then some other tips here. So we're prioritizing that energy, we're making nutrition realistic, and we're creating that nourished culture. We know what to look for and listen for now and kind of practice those among our teammates and coaches and parents. But we want to make sure that we recognize and talk about the risks that we covered today. We want to make sure that we're supporting our athletes with those access and planning to fueling, and knowing, what can we put on our plates multiple times a day to make sure that we're getting everything we need to perform. And then again, it really comes down to that culture as well of being aware and taking steps to foster that fueling. We're normalizing really good nutrition on our team and our community and beyond, because this is a really formative time for our athletes. When they're younger, especially in college too, it's just a very formative time, and it'll set those fueling habits the rest of their life. So it's really important to be aware of the risks with low fueling and how we can instead create really good culture around frequent fueling and understand how that can help our performance now, but also the rest of our lives.
So thank you guys for joining us today. Lizzie and I and the rest of this awesome nutrition team is available if you guys do have questions. And we really appreciate your time jumping on to Educate to Elevate today. Please feel free to also jump into the last couple sessions that we did talk about our fueling foundations and addressing barriers to fueling, as those are still live for you as well. And coming up next in March, we'll talk about brain health with some of our awesome TCO team, and sport performance again in April. So thank you guys for joining us today. And then if you do have questions, you could go ahead and head to the Educate to Elevate page. There will be a question box for you to input, as we are happy to support you and or get you connected to the right support system for yourselves and or the athletes that you do support.